When I was a kid, we lived in a remote, forgotten corner of the countryside. The kind of place people drive through without ever realizing it's inhabited. Just a gas station and a few rundown shops, swallowed by endless fields. My parents chose this place for reasons I never understood. They worked themselves into early graves, toiling in our cornfields that stretched out forever, disappearing into the horizon. As a child, there was something almost magical about the isolation. But as I grew older, that magic curdled into resentment. My sisters and I had to drive an hour west just to get to school, and the day we all left home for good was a liberation. But even more than the isolation, what drove me away was my father's obsession with scarecrows. He planted them everywhere. Every inch of our miles-long fields was dotted with them. I never understood how he managed it, but I swear, there wasn't a patch of ground without one of those grotesque figures. They were unlike any scarecrows I'd ever seen. Even now, as an adult, I get chills remembering them. They had an eerie realism to them, a grotesque hyper-detail that made your skin crawl. Their faces were twisted into expressions that seemed almost human, eyes that bulged unnervingly, lips contorted in silent screams. And their bodies, they didn't stand on poles like normal scarecrows. They were crucified. Their heads hung low, arms spread too wide, legs crossed unnaturally. From their midsections, hay spilled out like entrails, and their long, matted hair dripped black as if soaked in oil. My father always claimed it was just mops he dipped in paint, but even as a kid, that explanation never sat right with me. I was in my second year at the University of Michigan when I got the call from my mother. My father was dead. The news hit me like a punch to the gut, cold fear trickling down my spine. I listened to my mother's voice crackle through the phone, the words barely registering. But in that moment, all I could think about were those scarecrows. I imagined my father strung up like one of them, crucified in his own field. I shook the image from my mind, chalking it up to grief, to the shock of losing him. My mother pleaded with us to come home for the funeral. Reluctantly, we agreed, but the day before my flight, my sister called me. Her voice was hushed, trembling, as if speaking too loudly might awaken something. She needed to tell me something she'd kept buried for years. The night before my flight, I had a nightmare. I found myself in the middle of our cornfield, the stalks towering above me, hemming me in. The sky was a vivid, unnatural blue, too perfect to be real. A trail of red powder stretched before me, leading me on for what felt like hours. Eventually, I reached a clearing, a circle of dead stalks. In the center stood a single stake, a lone scarecrow tied to it. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a scarecrow at all. It was a man, dressed in the ragged clothes of one. I felt a force behind me, unseen hands pushing me toward the figure. As I approached, dread coiled in my gut, and I saw the scarecrow's face. It was my own. Suddenly, I felt long, spindly fingers wrap around my shoulders, and I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. I glanced at the clock. Late. I scrambled out the door, catching an Uber to the airport just in time. The flight home was a blur of anxiety and unease. By the time I reached our house, night had fully settled in. I sat in the car, staring at the darkened windows, my heart pounding as I tried to gather the courage to go inside. The house loomed before me, shadows creeping up its walls, giving it an almost sinister presence. When I finally stepped through the front door, the heavy silence enveloped me like a shroud. Everyone was inside, my sisters and my mother, but there was something terribly off. My mother looked different. She was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her bones, and her hair was thin and falling out in clumps. Dark circles hollowed her eyes, which darted nervously, as if seeing things the rest of us couldn't. I asked her what had happened, but she just gave me a strange look, a mix of confusion and annoyance. "I just need some rest," she murmured, her voice distant, like she was speaking through a fog. My sisters exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't our mother. She'd always been a strong, sharp woman, but now she seemed like a hollow shell of herself. Trying to piece together what was going on, I hesitantly asked about our father. I expected to hear he was at the morgue, but her answer sent a chill down my spine. "He's tucked away somewhere safe," she said with a flat, emotionless tone. The words hung in the air like a bad smell. My sisters and I stared at each other, alarmed. Something was very wrong. Our mother, seeming almost irritated by our concern, abruptly decided she was tired and wanted to go to bed. She shuffled off to her room without another word. My oldest sister tried to downplay it, suggesting that maybe she was just in shock. She excused herself to her old bedroom, leaving me and my other sister alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by the oppressive silence of the house. I put on a pot of coffee, knowing neither of us would be able to sleep that night. We tried to distract ourselves, talking about funny memories from our childhood. She told me about the time she broke into an animal shelter to rescue a dog that was already lined up for a home, and I recounted the embarrassing story of how I got into my frat. Somehow, as the night wore on, we ended up finding one of Dad's old liquor cabinets and spiking our coffee with whiskey. We played childish pranks on each other, laughing more than we had in years. But beneath it all, there was a tension, a fear we couldn't shake. Eventually, the conversation drifted back to that night she saw. Hesitantly, I asked if she remembered taking any drugs, maybe shrooms or something. She shook her head, her eyes haunted. I was sober, she said quietly, her voice trembling. I hadn't touched anything in months. She didn't want to talk about it anymore, and I didn't push. We ended up falling asleep on the couch around midnight, the unease settling over us like a blanket. I woke up suddenly with a pounding headache. The clock read 5 in the morning, but it was still pitch dark outside. Winter in this part of the country meant the sun wouldn't rise for another hour, and sometimes it felt like it never came up at all. I stumbled to the bathroom, my footsteps echoing in the silent house. As I stood there, I felt a sudden chill, a cold so sharp it cut through the whiskey fog in my head. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing, just shadows. Shaking off the eerie feeling, I walked back to the living room, but my sister was gone. I assumed she must have gone to her old bedroom to sleep more comfortably, so I decided to do the same. But when I entered my room, I noticed the window was wide open. The freezing night air rushed in, biting at my skin. I bolted from the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back as I sprinted to my rental car, fumbling with the keys in my panic. As soon as I got the door open, I jumped in, started the engine, and sped off into the darkness, the house disappearing in my rearview mirror. A month has passed since that night, but the horror still clings to me like a shadow. I thought I had escaped, but last week, the local authorities came to see me. They told me my mother and my sister were both dead. I tried to tell them everything I knew, about the scarecrows, the barn, the man with the pumpkin head, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Of course, they didn't believe me. They suspected it was me who had hurt them, but they had no evidence to prove it. When I asked about my other sister, they said there was no trace of her, as if she had simply vanished off the face of the earth. They said the search could take months, maybe years, but they were doing everything they could. But I know better. I know where she is. She's in that cornfield, trapped in whatever darkness took my mother. I can still see her standing there, on the edge of the rows, looking lost, looking empty. It haunts me, knowing that she's out there, and whatever possessed my mother has her now, too. I don't know if I will ever see her again, but I know that whatever was out there that night is still out there, waiting, watching. And as long as I'm alive, I'll never be free of it. The only escape is death. Maybe if I end my own life, I can break free from this nightmare. Maybe I'd be giving in to whatever it wants, but at least I won't have to be here to see it anymore. At least I won't have to live with the fear. I'm so tired of being afraid. Goodbye. This was the suicide note found on Jimmy Brooks's person. Jimmy was a patient at Forest Lake facility, diagnosed with severe schizophrenia. He had somehow escaped and convinced himself that his family was being tormented by scarecrows and strange figures in the cornfields. Tragically, every member of his family was brutally killed by him. The status of his sister, Martha Brooks, remains unknown.